Hello and welcome to Hippo CMMS. My name is Earl Mina and I work with the Training and Tech Department team with Hippo. Today's webinar is titled Equipment in Hippo is So Much More. Here's a look at today's agenda. We will take a quick look at all the amazing ways you can manage your equipment. Topics include finding equipment on the floor plan, the equipment detail screen, equipment downtime, running reports on equipment, the equipment grid, learning how to add equipment models and individual pieces of equipment. And then we'll end the session today with a look at the data integration services that Hippo has to offer. At the end of the webinar, there will be a questions and comments period. Here you will be able to answer a quick survey and ask any questions you might have. You can also use the bubble icon on your screen to ask a question anytime during the webinar. These questions will be answered after the webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that this webinar is going to be recorded and will be sent to all attendees once the webinar is over. Without further ado, let's begin. What is equipment in Hippo? Equipment in Hippo is more than just submitting work orders. One of the goals of a quality CMMS program is to manage your complete equipment details. For example, your CMMS will contain important equipment information such as work order history, serial and model information, upcoming scheduled work orders, and in-depth reporting data. This information is what you can get from your Hippo, and Hippo is built in a way where you can access it quickly and conveniently. For example, let's start at the floor plans. So the floor plan we'll take a look at today is in my Hippo plant facility. Let's click on Hippo plant. I'm using the advanced dashboard. Now the floor plan view is available for all HipPro Plus customers. Floor plans will give you a visual overview of what's going on in your facility, and it also provides you an opportunity to see what pieces of equipment have work orders. Let's go to the finishing floor plan. So here you can see my floor plan. I've got a couple different types of icons on the floor plan. There's a house icon that shows me there's a location-based work order. I'm more concerned with the gear-based icon. This tells me that one of my pieces of equipment have a work order associated to it. If I hover over the piece of equipment, this will give me the equipment name. And I can click on the piece of equipment, and there I can see what work orders are open for that piece of equipment. In this example, I have a piston pump. It looks like I've got 4 work orders associated to that piece of equipment. This is one way of tracking work orders for a piece of equipment. I can click on the work order number. This will open up the work order and give me information about what is on this type of work order. What's also great from the floor plan is the ability to access the equipment detail screen. So again, let's click on the name of the equipment. From here, let's click on the button that says View. This screen is what we call the equipment detail screen. This is your go-to destination for all information related to your piece of equipment. For example, I have the equipment name, serial number, I can see asset ID, I also have model information, what type of equipment it is, what work category, and I can also see any specs or manuals associated to that piece of equipment. If I click on the manual, I can quickly see the information I need to know to operate this piece of equipment accordingly. I'm going back to the equipment details screen. You can also see other important information, such as where it's located, any parts that are recommended anytime that you run a work order for that piece of equipment. Down below, you can see I have access to any current work orders. I can also view the history of a piece of equipment. Now you can view every single work order that was completed for this piece of equipment. In my date range, I'll go ahead and switch this to When I click the load button, I have all the work orders for this piston pump between January 1st, 2016 up until today's date. I can open up one of those work orders. This is a historical PM. Here's the information from that historical PM. Going back to the equipment details screen, I can also look at any upcoming scheduled work orders for this piece of equipment. The next time my PM is going to generate is shown right here. Now, if you also have multiple PMs for this piece of equipment, you will see every single upcoming PM for that piece of equipment. And down below, I can also look at equipment downtime history. Equipment downtime is a feature where you can report a piece of equipment as down if it's no longer up and running. When I click the load button, I can see all the different dates and times that a user has reported this piece of equipment. Now, for those of you who aren't using equipment downtime, it's a setting that you can activate in your global settings. By turning that on, you'll be able to use this red button that says report down. Now you also have to give permission to a user to report equipment as down, but when I click this button, it'll ask me to report what date this equipment was down. Let's say this is the date that we want to use. We'll click report down, and then for any user who's viewing the details of a piece of equipment, there'll be a warning indication to let them know that this piece of equipment was reported down. Now you can also access the equipment details screen in another place in Hippo. For those of you who aren't using Hippo Plus, you can absolutely get to your equipment details screen by accessing the submit work order form. As you know, this is the form that you use to submit a demand work order. If I'm going to request a repair for my piston pump, my next step is to name it, pick the type, and then pick my piston pump from the list. When you're selecting a piece of equipment, it's also from here where you can pick and select and see the equipment detail screen. I went ahead and picked a different type of equipment. This is for an air compressor. A great example I'd like to use is if you're submitting a work order for an air compressor, but you're not entirely too sure if you're picking the right one, clicking the equipment detail screen will pull up the right information. In this facility, I have multiple air compressors. To confirm I'm selecting the right one, maybe I'll go ahead and compare the serial number, or I can look at the ID tag, which is a photo I took, uploaded it to my equipment, and now it's part of my equipment detail screen. I also took a photo of the air compressor itself. I have a number of these units, so I only have to take one photo and apply to the equipment model. Now, for those of you who went ahead and purchased a premium onboarding to get your Hippo up and running, you'll recall that an audit specialist came down to your facility, collected this information, took these photos, and had this data uploaded to your system for you. For those of you who are managing your equipment and are interested in learning how to upload photos and get this information in there, later on in the webinar, we'll talk about how do you add an equipment model and then how do you add the piece of equipment. The last thing I'll quickly point out on the equipment detail screen is this section that says scan code. Some of you may already be utilizing the scan code feature. For those of you that aren't, the scan code feature works in a way where you can ask Hippo to generate a specific type of barcode. You can print that barcode, label your piece of equipment, and with your mobile device, you can scan that barcode and it'll pull up your equipment detail screen along with any current work orders. Now, this is just a small sample of the information that you can get for a piece of equipment and how Hippo can store it for you. For many users, reporting on equipment is equally as important as storing the information. In Hippo, you can run a variety of different reports. So let's close this equipment detail screen and head to the reports panel. In Hippo, you can run a couple different types of reports. You can run a current work order report, which will show you any work orders open that can be specific to a piece of equipment, or you can even search by a specific model type. You can look at maintenance history. This will give you a complete history of your piece of equipment, any work orders that were completed, cost association, downtime. We'll be looking at this report in greater detail. Before we get there, you can also run an inventory report. This is not equipment related, but for those of you who are interested in utilizing parts, you can look at your inventory, and you can also track equipment depreciation. And for those of you who don't see equipment depreciation, it's a feature that you have to activate under your global settings, and you have to enter some additional values, which we'll see later on the equipment grid. For the purpose of this demo, we're going to stick with the maintenance history to get some information about some of our equipment. Before I generate this report, I'm going to select a couple different types of criteria here. I'd like to go ahead and select graphs as one of my views for my report. I'm going to select some of my air compressors and compare the performance of my air compressors on this report. And the final thing I'll do is select a date range. I'm only concerned with looking at a date range from the beginning of this year up until today. With my criteria selected, we'll scroll back up. We can click the reports icon, and this will populate a new report in a new window. So here's a look at the maintenance history report for my air compressors. Let's make this window a little bit bigger. At the very top of the page, this tells me a summary of my work orders. I can see how many work orders were PMs, how many work orders were demand work orders. Again, PMs are things that you plan for. They're your preventative maintenance. For this time period, it appears I've ran 12 PMs, and I've got demand work orders, which are unscheduled, unplanned maintenance. I've had 21 different demand work orders. In total, I've had 33 work orders for my collection of air compressors. Moving down the report, there's a section for costs associated to my pieces of equipment. We can see in the color yellow, which corresponds to labor. Within this time period, I've spent $1,190 on labor for my air compressors. For my parts, I spent a little bit more. When I completed work orders and there were parts assigned to that work order, you can see that I've spent $1,930 on parts and upkeep for my pieces of equipment. Now, this value, $4,780, this is for invoices. Invoices is related to maybe company information that you added to a work order, or if you've purchased materials or paid for shipping, labor. Anything that you've added as an invoice will appear in this bucket. The final is variance. Variance is if you are utilizing the estimated cost. It's the variance between before and after. In total, you can see for my air compressors, I've spent about $8,200 within 4 months. So something is up there. That's a lot of maintenance in a short amount of time. Down below, we have resource information. Just a refresher, resources are your maintenance technicians. They're the individuals that perform the work in your facility. This displays how much I've spent per resource. First person Anne, in these collection of work orders, she's worked 4 hours, labor costs about $320. Down here, we've got Bernard Lott. He's worked 10 hours at $350. Now, this section of the report is what I feel is the most useful. This is a comparison of your pieces of equipment. What I'm seeing in front of me is 4 air compressors and the work orders completed for each air compressor. Now, air compressor number 1, you can see that there were a lot of work orders completed. I had my routine maintenance, my 10 PMs, but I've also had 15 demand work orders. So in 4 months, there were 15 separate tickets for this air compressor. With the other 3 pieces of equipment, air compressor number 2, air compressor number 3, air compressor number 4, only 3 work orders, So you can see that there's less maintenance on these ones. I can also take it a step further and analyze downtime. Clicking downtime will show me the hours of downtime per piece of equipment. It's no surprise that air compressor number one, with the amount of demand work orders that were submitted for it, it's highly likely there was downtime for my air compressor. Hovering over the dot above the air compressor, I've had 55 hours of downtime, whereas air compressor number two, air compressor number three, and air compressor number four have 0 hours of downtime. So from this data, you would probably suggest that I should replace air compressor number one. Now there's a lot of information on this report, and because we're limited in time, and I do want to keep it specific to equipment, I won't go in great detail about every single function of a report, just to highlight a couple of things that we'll see here. These are the work orders for each piece of equipment. One quick thing you can do is grab the ID number, plug it into your search bar on the dashboard. That'll open up the completed work order. Next type of table contains the same information from the graph. You can get things like percent completed, PMs generated, cost information. This is the same information that we saw above in the graphs. I'm going to jump ahead and go down to the equipment table. Now in the equipment table, this will show you right off the bat how many work orders you had for each piece of equipment. As you can see, air compressor number one's got 15 demand work orders. The next closest is air compressor number two. There's been a lot of maintenance on that air compressor, so I think I'm going to go ahead and remove that from my inventory. So anytime that you need to edit, delete, add new pieces of equipment, that happens on the equipment grid. Let's close this report. The X to go back to our facility screen, and then we'll click Facility Admin, Equipment. Now the equipment grid is where all of your pieces of equipment are stored. Now for those of you that are in your onboarding period, for those of you that got Hippo to import some pieces of equipment into your system, this is where all of it is stored. Now for those of you that are managing your equipment, this is where you go to see your master equipment list. Depending on your permissions, you may be able to delete a piece of equipment. You may also be able to edit a piece of equipment, and you also may be able to add a piece of equipment. Now, adding a piece of equipment is a two-step process. Before we add another air compressor or another piece of equipment, we first have to enter the equipment model. Entering that information is off of the equipment models panel. Now, equipment models and equipment can be a little bit confusing. The best way to understand it is that the equipment model contains manufacturer information, whereas the equipment is the individual piece of equipment. If I have a look through my list here, we know that I have multiple air compressors within my facility. What's important to know is that each air compressor has its own respective type of equipment model. They're all from the Atlas Copco family, but different models include 55, 55 plus, GA75. These are all different models. They've got different specs associated with them as well too. So we know that my air compressor number one is not performing very well. I went ahead and purchased another air compressor. This air compressor is from a different manufacturer, so I'm not going to be able to just put it in as air compressor number 6. I have to tell Hippo what is the brand information for that equipment model. To do so, I'll click the plus icon. A new data field will open up at the top of the page. First column is called name, and how we suggest you enter your manufacturer information, your model information for your piece of equipment will look like so. Type in the manufacturer name, type in the model number of that piece of equipment, and then enter type, air compressor. So again, that was created with manufacturer name, model number, and type. And there are two other mandatory fields you have to complete. That's equipment model type and work category. Equipment model type is very simple. We know that our type was air compressor. So within this drop-down list, or if you do not have it in your list, you can add it. I see air compressor is there, so I'll go ahead and pick that item. Work category is something that you see in a lot of places of Hippo. This is utilized for work order search or reports. I'm going to stick to the model that I have for the other air compressors and select general maintenance. Those are the mandatory fields. You can make use of the additional fields to get more information onto your equipment details screen. For example, we'll go ahead and type in the manufacturer information. We'll add a description. In most cases, the description is the same as the equipment model name. We'll just copy this record here. My model number. For anyone who's using meter-based PMs and looking at units off a piece of equipment, you can tell Hippo that this one runs off hours. As well, if you know if there are any parts that should be assigned to the work order whenever someone submits. We saw earlier that you can also assign an image. I don't have an image ready for this air compressor, so let's just save the record here and take a look at one of the other air compressors that I have in the system. Here's a photo that I've uploaded. Now, if you end up buying multiple air compressors and they're all the same model, you only have to take one photo because they all look exactly the same. What makes them different is the ID tag, the identifying tag for each individual air compressor, and that ID tag you'll upload individually. We'll get there when we get to the equipment grid. So just use my search field here, type in DeWalt, and you can see I've got my DeWalt air compressor model information ready in the system. So with that entered, my next step is to go to the equipment grid and enter in the individual air compressor. So to add my air compressor, like on the equipment models grid, I'll click the plus icon. Now for those of you who spend a lot of time entering data into Hippo, you'll notice that the equipment grid is a little bit unique. This is one grid that has a pop-up instead of clicking into the grid to edit the fields. And the reason for this change is to improve the performance of Hippo. We discovered that adding equipment with a pop-up window actually speeds up the system rather than an interactive grid. So let's go ahead and add my air compressor now. Mandatory fields are highlighted in red. We'll begin with name. I'm going to stick to my convention of naming my air compressors. It looks like I had 5 in that list, so I'm going to go ahead and add air compressor number 6. We added our model information for the air compressor, but if I did not, I can always add the model information. Next two fields are floor plan and location. This is where you tell Hippo where that piece of equipment is in your facility. I've also got a field for serial number. You can also type in asset ID. And you've also got a large text body for description. Next, we'll tell Hippo that this piece of equipment is active. ID tag I mentioned earlier. Now this is the individual tag for that piece of equipment. I don't have a picture ready for my air compressor number 6, so when I save this data, we'll take a look at one of my other air compressors. There's a field for meter reading. If you're tracking the current reading of hours or whatever value it is for your piece of equipment. Install date, purchase cost, life expectancy. And once you enter that data and you run the depreciation report, Hippo's formula will calculate what the value is for that piece of equipment down the line. You can also add information such as electrical panel, the distributor, and upload a mechanical drawing to your piece of equipment. So I don't have all that information now, but let's save this. Now let's jump back to air compressor number 1, just to point out that ID tag again. Remember that this is the tag from the piece of equipment, and this is the picture of the equipment model. So if I'm going to edit this air compressor, we'll click the notepad icon. Maybe I want to change the ID tag. It comes from this screen where you can delete, add, make any changes. It's important to note that you can upload as many images as you want per piece of equipment. They do have a maximum file size of 100 kilobytes, and you can only display one. In most cases, you don't need to display more than one image. The equipment model and the ID tag is usually sufficient for viewing your piece of equipment. And before I leave this page, let's see if I can actually mark this piece of equipment as inactive. My best guess is no. And as you can see, it's because I have to complete a couple work orders. Just for time purposes, we won't get into that. I think a lot of people here know how to complete work orders. So as you can see, adding equipment into Hippo is quite simple, although it can take a little bit of time if you've got a lot of pieces of equipment and you want to make sure you have all the right information and all the necessary information entered for that piece of equipment. Now, for those of you that don't really have the time to enter that data into Hippo, our support team does provide a service where we can mass import all of your pieces of equipment into your database. So before we end the webinar today, I'd like to point out how data integration works. The best example I'd like to use is if you're a current Hippo user and you open up another facility and you would like to get that information into the system, instead of you spending time entering that data one by one, our data integration team can set you up with a easy to use Hippo spreadsheet. It's much faster to complete. Once that spreadsheet is completed, you can send it to our support team and we can quickly mass import all of your pieces of equipment. Now you can also take that one step ahead. Earlier in the webinar, I briefly mentioned audits. Audits is another service that's provided by our data integration team. If you really want to take advantage of the Hippo system and you don't have a lot of time, Hippo can arrange for an audit specialist to come down to your facility, catalog your entire equipment, gather model information, serial information, take ID tag photos, equipment model photos, and upload that into your database. Now, if you're interested in utilizing any of these services, please reach out to our support team at support@hippocmms.com. We'll ask you a couple qualifying questions about how much equipment you have in your facility, what kind of data you're looking to import, and send you a quote with some more information. So this is the end of the webinar. I just want to thank everyone for attending today. This webinar wasn't intended to be very long, but If you do have some questions, just a reminder, there is a quick survey that's going to follow. A couple questions for you to answer, as well as an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have. So thanks again for attending the webinar. I hope you enjoyed what you saw today, and we hope you're getting the most out of your Hippo. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.